We have a pretty interesting podcast called Bookworm. Now, Bookworm is not a very mainstreamy podcast. Tim Ferriss, Shane Parrish, these are all fairly mainstream, but Bookworm is a bit of a hidden treasure, I think. And it's these two dudes in America who just talk about books. Like every week, they read a new book, or every other week, and then they discuss it. And so I actually found a bunch of book recommendations through the Bookworm podcast that I might not have come across before. This one, Make Time, is a book that I discovered through the Bookworm podcast. And so I read the book and I really liked it, and then I actually made a video about the book and then reached out to the author John Zeratsky, who then I had on an old episode of my own podcast. And actually now John and I are internet friends. So the other day I hopped on a Zoom call with him where he was giving me advice for how to write my own book. And so I discovered this through the Bookworm podcast. And there have been a bunch of books where I've been thinking, oh, I don't know if I should read this book. And then hearing these two guys on the Bookworm podcast discuss the book has either made me decide to read it or decide to not read it. And either way, it's been a way of saving time and just listening to an interesting conversation about interesting stuff like books. Next on the list, we have Not Overthinking. Now, Not Overthinking is actually the weekly podcast that I do with my brother. This has been going on for the last 3 years. If you didn't know it was a thing, it's a thing. We have a YouTube channel, we do video podcasts as well, and he and I just talk about, life and happiness and anything in between that's on our minds. And so when I was going through my podcast history, I found that I've re-listened to episodes of Not Overthinking around about 15 times, just because it's kind of interesting. And it's now particularly interesting looking at the back catalog, 3 years ago, what's the sort of stuff me and my brother were thinking about. Again, links to that in the video description if you want to check it out. Sadly, I only listen to one health podcast, and that is the Huberman Lab. That's a podcast I've started listening to fairly recently when I decided, hey, I was going to take more care of my health. And the Huberman Lab podcast is amazing. It's by this guy called Andrew Huberman, who is a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. And each episode, he does a deep dive into a specific part of what the science says about how we can live kind of healthier, better lives.